The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Valdoria Palace as Prince Edward made his way through the grand corridors. His footsteps echoed in the silence, each sound seeming to carry the weight of the discovery that had kept him awake all night. In his hand, he clutched a leather folder containing documents that would change everything his family thought they knew about Queen Isabella. Edward had always been close to his father, King Alexander. Even after the king's remarriage to Isabella 5 years ago, their bond had remained strong. The kingdom had welcomed Isabella with open arms, charmed by her grace and apparent devotion to the crown. She had stepped into her role as queen with elegance, supporting charitable causes and standing beside the king at every public event. To the world, they appeared to be the perfect royal couple, having found love later in life after the tragic death of Edward's mother, Queen Catherine. But the documents Edward had discovered told a very different story. It had started innocently enough. Edward was reviewing financial reports for the royal estate when he noticed some unusual transactions. Large sums of money had been moving through accounts he didn't recognize, all bearing Isabella's signature. His curiosity piqued. He had asked his trusted aide, Marcus, to investigate quietly. What Marcus uncovered was far more disturbing than Edward had imagined. Isabella had been secretly selling royal properties and artifacts to private collectors and foreign investors. Pieces of the kingdom's heritage, some dating back centuries, had been quietly auctioned off through intermediaries. But that wasn't the worst part. The money from these sales wasn't going into the royal treasury or even Isabella's personal accounts. It was being funneled to a company owned by her brother, Ricardo, who had been using the funds to purchase land and businesses throughout the neighboring kingdom of Astoria. The implications were staggering. Isabella wasn't just stealing from the royal family. She was potentially compromising national security by moving royal assets to a foreign nation. Some of the documents suggested that Ricardo was working with Astorian officials, possibly setting up a network that could be used to influence Valdorian politics and economics. Edward's hands trembled slightly as he approached his father's private study. King Alexander was known for his morning routine of reviewing newspapers and correspondence before the day's official duties began. It was the only time of day when the king was truly alone, without advisors, secretaries, or even Isabella by his side. Edward knocked gently on the ornate wooden door. "Father, may I speak with you?" King Alexander looked up from his reading, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile at the sight of his son. At 62, the king still cut an impressive figure, his silver hair neatly combed and his posture straight despite the burdens of leadership he had carried for over 2 decades. "Edward, of course. Come in. Come in." The king gestured to the leather chair across from his desk. "You look troubled, my boy. What's weighing on your mind?" Edward closed the door carefully behind him and took a seat. The study was his father's sanctuary, filled with family photographs, military honors, and books that showed the king's love of history and philosophy. A portrait of Queen Catherine hung above the fireplace, her gentle eyes seeming to watch over the room even in death. "Father, I've discovered something about Isabella that I think you need to know." Edward's voice was steady, but the king could hear the underlying tension. King Alexander set down his newspaper, his expression growing serious. "What kind of something?" Edward opened the folder and began spreading documents across the desk. Bank statements, property transfer papers, correspondence, and photographs of royal artifacts all laid out like pieces of a complex puzzle. "Isabella has been selling royal property and artifacts without authorization. Look at these transactions." Edward pointed to highlighted entries on the bank statements. "Over the past 3 years, she's moved nearly $50 million through these accounts." The king leaned forward, studying the papers with growing concern. His fingers traced over the familiar royal seal on several documents, Isabella's signature clearly visible beneath. "These pieces," Edward continued, showing photographs of ornate jewelry, ancient tapestries, and ceremonial weapons. They're all from the royal collection. Some of them are irreplaceable historical artifacts. This necklace here belonged to your great-grandmother. This sword was carried by the first king of Valdoria. King Alexander's face grew pale as he recognized item after item. These weren't just valuable objects. They were symbols of the kingdom's heritage, pieces that belonged to the people of Valdoria, not to any individual to sell for personal gain. "But where is the money going?" the king asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Edward pulled out another set of documents. "That's the most troubling part, Father. The money isn't staying in our kingdom. It's all going to her brother Ricardo's company in Astoria. And according to these records, Ricardo has been using the funds to purchase strategic properties and businesses near our border." The king studied a map that Edward had prepared, showing the locations of Ricardo's purchases. They formed a pattern along the Valdorian-Astorian border, concentrating around key transportation routes and communication centers. "This looks like—" King Alexander paused, the full implications beginning to sink in. "Like someone is setting up a network for economic or political influence. Yes," Edward finished. "Father, I think Isabella might be working with Astorian interests to establish a foothold in our kingdom. Whether she realizes it or not, her actions could be considered treasonous." The word hung in the air like a physical presence. Treason. It was a charge that hadn't been leveled against a member of the royal family in over a century. King Alexander sat back in his chair, his hands shaking slightly as he processed what his son was telling him. The woman he had married, the woman he had trusted with his heart and his kingdom, might be betraying everything he held sacred. "Are you certain of this evidence?" the king asked, his voice hoarse with emotion. "I've had Marcus verify everything independently. The financial trails are clear, the property transfers are documented, and I've even had experts confirm that several of the artifacts shown in these photographs are no longer in the royal vault." Edward reached across the desk and placed his hand over his father's. "I'm sorry, Father. I know how much Isabella means to you." King Alexander closed his eyes, and for a moment he looked every one of his 62 years. The weight of the crown had always been heavy, but personal betrayal added a dimension of pain he had never experienced, not even during the darkest days after Catherine's death. "How long have you known?" the king asked. "I started investigating a week ago when I noticed the irregular transactions. I wanted to be absolutely certain before I brought this to you. The last thing I wanted was to damage your relationship with Isabella over a misunderstanding." The king nodded, appreciating his son's caution and loyalty. Edward had always been thoughtful, never one to act rashly or spread rumors. If he was bringing this evidence forward, it was because he was convinced of its validity. "What do you think we should do?" King Alexander asked, looking at his son with a mixture of pride and sadness. Edward was proving himself ready to shoulder the responsibilities of future kingship, even when it meant making difficult and painful decisions. "I think we need to confront Isabella directly, but we also need to be prepared for the possibility that this goes deeper than just her actions. If she's working with Astorian agents, there might be others involved. We should consider bringing in our security services to investigate the full scope of the operation." King Alexander stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace gardens. Isabella was out there somewhere, probably in her morning meeting with the head gardener, discussing the seasonal flower arrangements. To anyone watching, she would appear to be the devoted queen, concerned with the beauty and maintenance of her adopted home. "She seemed so genuine when we met," the king said softly. "After Catherine died, I thought I would never find love again. Isabella appeared in my life like a gift, understanding my grief but also helping me see a future beyond it." Edward joined his father at the window. "Perhaps her feelings for you are genuine, Father. That doesn't excuse what she's done, but it's possible she got involved in something that spiraled beyond her control." Or perhaps I was just a lonely widower who was easy to manipulate, the king replied bitterly. Don't blame yourself for trusting someone you love. That's what makes you a good man and a good king. The blame lies with whoever chose to betray that trust. King Alexander turned back to his son, and Edward could see the transformation taking place. The hurt and confused husband was being replaced by the decisive ruler who had guided Valdoria through economic challenges, natural disasters, and political upheavals. We'll need to be strategic about this, the king said. If Isabella is working with foreign agents, we can't risk alerting them that we're aware of their activities. We need to gather more intelligence before we make any moves. Edward nodded. I agree. I suggest we quietly increase security around the palace and begin monitoring Isabella's communications and movements. We should also reach out to our intelligence contacts in Astoria to see what they know about Ricardo's activities. And we'll need to secure the remaining artifacts in the royal collection. If Isabella has access to the vaults, she could remove more items before we can stop her. The two men spent the next hour planning their response, their conversation shifting from the emotional revelation to the practical necessities of protecting the kingdom. It was a conversation that would have been unthinkable just a few hours earlier, but now it was essential. As they prepared to leave the study, King Alexander placed a hand on his son's shoulder. Edward, I want you to know how proud I am of you for bringing this to me. It couldn't have been easy. It wasn't, Father, but the kingdom comes first, always. Yes, it does. And someday when you wear the crown, I hope you never have to face a betrayal like this from someone you love. Edward looked at the portrait of his mother hanging above the fireplace. I think Mother would have wanted us to protect Valdoria, no matter the personal cost. King Alexander followed his son's gaze to Catherine's portrait. Yes, she would have. She always said that being royal meant putting duty above personal desires. As they prepared to leave the study and begin the careful investigation that would either clear Isabella's name or confirm their worst fears, neither man could know that Isabella was, at that very moment, in her private chambers making a phone call to Astoria, or that she had already noticed some of the missing documents from her personal safe. The game of deception that had been played in shadows was about to move into the light, and the stakes couldn't be higher for the kingdom of Valdoria. Isabella stood before her bedroom window, watching the palace guards change their shifts below. Something was different about their routine today. They were more alert, their movements more deliberate, and she had noticed additional security personnel positioned at entrances she had never seen monitored before. Her fingers drummed nervously against the window frame as she tried to piece together what might have changed. The Queen had always been observant, a skill that had served her well during her rise from a modest background to the heights of royal power. Growing up as the daughter of a struggling businessman in the neighboring kingdom of Astoria, she had learned to read people and situations quickly. It was this ability that had first caught King Alexander's attention at a diplomatic reception, and it was the same skill that now told her something was seriously wrong. Her phone buzzed with a message from her brother Ricardo. The buyer in Geneva is asking questions about the provenance of the emerald set. Says there are rumors in collector circles about royal items being investigated. We need to talk. Isabella's heart raced as she deleted the message. The emerald jewelry set had been one of their most lucrative sales, fetching nearly $3 million from a private collector who specialized in European royal artifacts. If questions were being asked about its authenticity or legal status, it could unravel everything they had worked to build. She walked to her private safe, hidden behind a false panel in her dressing room wall. Her hands shook as she entered the combination, and when the door opened, her worst fears were confirmed. Several documents were missing, including bank statements and correspondence with Ricardo. She was certain she had left them in a specific order, but now they were gone entirely. Isabella's mind raced through the possibilities. The cleaning staff had been with the palace for years and had never shown any interest in her personal belongings. Her personal assistant, Maria, was completely trustworthy and had limited access to the safe combination. That left only a few people who might have the authority and capability to access her private documents. The Queen realized she needed to move quickly. If someone had discovered the financial transactions, it was only a matter of time before the entire operation would be exposed. She had never intended for things to go this far, but once they had started selling small items to help Ricardo's struggling business, it had become easier and easier to justify taking larger and more valuable pieces. Isabella picked up her secure phone and dialed Ricardo's number. He answered on the first ring, his voice tense with worry. "Isabella, thank God you called. We have a serious problem." "I know. Someone has been in my safe. Documents are missing, and I think we're being watched." Ricardo was quiet for a moment before responding. "How much do you think they know?" "Enough to be dangerous. We need to assume they have all our financial records and transaction histories." "What about the Astorian connection? Do they know about the properties I've been purchasing?" Isabella had hoped her brother would never ask that question. The truth was that the property purchases had been his idea, not hers. Ricardo had convinced her that establishing a business presence near the Valdorian border would be profitable for both of them, but she had begun to suspect there were political motivations she hadn't been told about. "Ricardo, I need you to be completely honest with me. Are you working with anyone else on these property deals? Any government officials or political groups?" The silence that followed was all the answer she needed. "Isabella, it's not what you think. Yes, there are some Astorian officials who are interested in improving economic ties with Valdoria, and they've provided some guidance on which properties would be most strategic, but it's all legitimate business." "Strategic for what?" Isabella's voice was sharp with growing anger and fear. "For trade routes, communication networks, that sort of thing. Nothing treasonous or illegal." But Isabella knew her brother well enough to hear the hesitation in his voice. Ricardo had always been ambitious, always looking for shortcuts to success and influence. If Astorian officials were involved, there was likely much more to the story than simple business development. "Listen to me very carefully," Isabella said, her voice low and urgent. "I want you to shut down everything immediately. Halt all property purchases, cancel any pending deals, and distance yourself from whatever officials you've been working with." "Isabella, I can't just—" "You can, and you will. I'm not going to let your political schemes destroy my marriage or bring down the royal family." After ending the call, Isabella sat on her bed and tried to think clearly. She had married King Alexander out of love, despite what her critics might believe. The lonely widow who had attended that diplomatic reception 6 years ago had been genuinely moved by the king's grief and strength. Alexander had offered her a life of purpose and meaning she had never imagined possible, but she had also seen an opportunity to help her struggling family. Ricardo's business had been failing, drowning in debt from failed investments and poor decisions. When Isabella had access to the royal collection, it had seemed like a victimless crime to sell a few pieces that were never displayed publicly. The royal family had so much history and wealth, surely they wouldn't miss a few artifacts that had been gathering dust in storage. One piece had led to another, and before she knew it, Isabella was moving millions of dollars to help Ricardo establish what she thought was a legitimate business. She had convinced herself that she was helping to create economic opportunities that would benefit both kingdoms. But if Ricardo was working with political groups, if the property purchases were part of some larger scheme, then she had been manipulated into something far more serious than theft. Isabella's thoughts were interrupted by a gentle knock on her door. "Your Majesty, you asked me to remind you about your meeting with the Children's Hospital Board," called Maria, her personal assistant. "Thank you, Maria. I'll be ready in a few minutes." Isabella realized she needed to maintain her normal routine while she figured out how to handle the situation. If she started acting suspicious or canceling appointments, it would only confirm whatever suspicions had already been raised. She dressed carefully in a navy blue suit that Alexander had once complimented and spent extra time on her makeup to hide the stress and sleepless night. As she prepared to leave her chambers, Isabella made a decision that would determine the course of everything that followed. Instead of going to her meeting, she would go to Alexander first. She would tell him everything, throw herself on his mercy, and hope that their love was strong enough to survive her betrayal. It was a desperate gamble, but it seemed like her only chance to control how the truth came out. Isabella made her way through the palace corridors. Noting the increased security presence and the way certain staff members avoided making eye contact with her. Word was clearly spreading that something significant was happening, though probably no one except the highest levels of palace leadership knew exactly what. She found Alexander in the throne room, meeting with his advisors about upcoming trade negotiations. The irony wasn't lost on her that he was discussing legitimate diplomatic relations while she had been undermining them with secret deals. "Alexander," she called out, interrupting the meeting. "May I speak with you privately? It's urgent." The king looked surprised by her sudden appearance and the intensity in her voice. His advisors began gathering their papers, clearly sensing that whatever the queen needed to discuss was not for their ears. "Of course, my dear. Gentlemen, we'll continue this later." As the last advisor left the room, Alexander approached Isabella with concern evident on his face. "You look upset. What's wrong?" Isabella took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would either save her marriage or destroy it completely. "Alexander, I need to tell you something, and I need you to hear all of it before you respond." The king's expression grew more serious. "All right, I'm listening. I've been selling royal artifacts and properties without permission. The money has been going to my brother Ricardo in Astoria. I thought I was helping him establish a legitimate business, but I've discovered that he may be working with political groups there." King Alexander stared at her for a long moment, his face showing no emotion. Isabella had expected anger, hurt, betrayal, but the complete absence of reaction was somehow worse. "How long?" he asked finally. 3 years, since about 6 months after we married." "How much?" "Nearly $50 million in total." Alexander turned away from her, walking toward the throne that had been occupied by his family for generations. Isabella watched his shoulders sag slightly under the weight of her confession. "I know what you must think of me," she continued. "I know how this looks. But I want you to know that my feelings for you have always been genuine. I never married you for access to the royal collection. I married you because I love you." King Alexander still hadn't turned around. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but clear. "Isabella, I already know." The queen felt her world shift beneath her feet. "What?" "Edward discovered the financial transactions a week ago. We've been investigating the full scope of the situation." Isabella sank into one of the ornate chairs along the wall, the full implications of Alexander's words hitting her like physical blows. If they had known for a week, if they had been investigating, then they knew far more than just the basic facts she had tried to confess. "What else do you know?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Alexander finally turned to face her, and Isabella could see the pain in his eyes. "We know about Ricardo's property purchases. We know about his connections to Astorian officials. We know about the systematic removal of historical artifacts from the royal collection. Alexander, I can explain." "Can you? Can you explain why you chose to betray not just me, but the entire kingdom?" "Those artifacts didn't belong to me personally, Isabella. They belong to the people of Valdoria. They're part of our national heritage." Isabella felt tears beginning to form in her eyes. I thought they were just sitting in storage. I thought no one would miss them. And I truly believed Ricardo was building something that would benefit both our kingdoms economically. What you believe doesn't matter now. What matters is what you did, and what Ricardo and his associates are planning to do with the network they've built along our border. The Queen looked up sharply. What network? Alexander studied her face carefully before responding. You really don't know, do you? Isabella, your brother has been working with Astorian intelligence services to establish surveillance and communication posts along our border. The properties he's been purchasing aren't for business development. They're for espionage operations. Isabella felt physically sick as the full scope of what she had unwittingly enabled became clear. She had thought she was helping her brother save his failing business. Instead, she had funded a foreign intelligence operation against her adopted kingdom. I didn't know, she whispered. Alexander, I swear to you, I had no idea it was anything more than business ventures. The king walked over and sat in the chair across from her. For the first time since her confession began, his expression softened slightly. I believe you, he said. But belief doesn't change the situation we're now facing. The question is, what we do next. Isabella looked up at him through her tears. What are my options? That depends on several factors. Are you willing to cooperate fully with our investigation? Are you prepared to help us understand exactly what Ricardo and his associates have been doing? And most importantly, are you willing to help us stop whatever they're planning? Isabella nodded without hesitation. Yes, absolutely. I'll do whatever I can to fix this. It may not be enough to save your position as queen. The scandal alone could damage the monarchy's reputation severely. And if there's any evidence that you knowingly participated in espionage activities, there isn't, Isabella said quickly. I was manipulated and foolish, but I wasn't trying to harm Valdoria. Alexander leaned back in his chair, and Isabella could see him shifting into the role of king, weighing the political and personal implications of every possible course of action. There's something else you need to know, he said finally. Edward was the one who discovered your activities and brought the evidence to me. Isabella closed her eyes, remembering all the times Edward had been kind to her, welcoming her into the family and treating her like a second mother. The thought that she had betrayed his trust along with Alexander's made her feel even worse. He must hate me, she said. He's disappointed and hurt, but Edward is also concerned about what this means for the kingdom's security. Right now, that has to be our priority. Isabella nodded, understanding that her personal feelings and marriage would have to wait while they dealt with the potential threat to national security. What do you need me to do? Alexander stood and walked to a secure phone on a side table. First, we're going to call Ricardo together. You're going to find out exactly what he and his associates are planning, and you're going to help us stop it. As Alexander dialed the number, Isabella realized that the next few hours would determine not just her own fate, but possibly the future relationship between Valdoria and Astoria. The queen, who had once dreamed of being a bridge between the two kingdoms, had instead become the weak link that could lead to conflict between them. The secure conference room in the palace basement had been designed for the kingdom's most sensitive discussions. Its walls were lined with materials that blocked electronic surveillance, and only the highest-ranking officials knew of its existence. King Alexander, Prince Edward, Isabella, and the head of Valdorian intelligence, Director Sarah Collins, sat around the polished oak table as speakerphone technology connected them to Ricardo in Astoria. Isabella's hands trembled as she prepared to make the call that would either expose a foreign espionage operation or destroy what remained of her relationship with her brother. King Alexander had made it clear that her cooperation in this investigation would be a major factor in determining her own fate. Remember, Director Collins said quietly, we need him to provide specific details about locations, personnel, and planned activities. The more concrete information we can gather, the better we can assess the actual threat level. Isabella nodded and dialed Ricardo's private number. The phone rang 3 times before her brother answered, his voice immediately tense with worry. "Isabella, I've been trying to reach you all day. There are rumors spreading in business circles here about royal artifacts being investigated. We need to shut everything down immediately." "Ricardo, I'm calling because the situation is much worse than we thought. The royal family knows about our financial arrangements, and they know about your property purchases." There was a long silence before Ricardo responded. "How much do they know?" Isabella looked across the table at King Alexander, who nodded encouragingly. "They know everything, Ricardo. The bank transfers, the artifact sales, the properties along the border. They know about your connections to Astorian officials." "Isabella, listen to me carefully." Ricardo's voice became urgent. "You need to deny everything. Claim the documents are forgeries or that someone else had access to your accounts. We can still contain this if you stay strong." Director Collins leaned forward and whispered, "Ask him about the communication equipment." "Ricardo, I need you to tell me the truth about something. What kind of equipment have you been installing at these border properties?" Another long pause. Isabella could hear voices in the background on Ricardo's end, as if he was consulting with other people. "It's just standard business communication systems, Isabella. Nothing unusual." "What kind of business requires surveillance equipment pointed toward Valdorian military installations?" The question seemed to catch Ricardo off guard. "How could you possibly know about—" He stopped himself, but the damage was already done. Director Collins made rapid notes and signaled to Isabella to keep pressing for information. "Ricardo, I'm going to ask you one more time to tell me the truth. Are you working with Astorian intelligence services?" The silence stretched for nearly a minute before Ricardo finally answered. "Isabella, some opportunities came up that were too good to pass up. Yes. Certain government officials approached me about establishing observation posts. But it's nothing that threatens Valdoria. It's just intelligence gathering that both kingdoms engage in routinely." King Alexander's face darkened with anger, but he remained silent as Isabella continued the interrogation. "What kind of intelligence gathering, Ricardo? What exactly are they trying to observe?" "Military movements, communication patterns, economic activities, standard border monitoring that every country does." Director Collins wrote a note and slid it across to Isabella. "Ask about planned operations." "Are there any planned operations beyond just observation?" Ricardo's voice became more guarded. "I don't know what you mean." "Ricardo, please, I'm trying to help you here, but I need to know if there's anything else planned." "Any operations? Any activities beyond just watching and listening?" "Isabella, who are you talking to? It sounds like you're reading questions from someone else." The tension in the room became palpable as everyone realized Ricardo was growing suspicious of the line of questioning. Isabella looked at King Alexander, who made a decision that would change everything that followed. He leaned toward the phone and spoke directly. "Ricardo, this is King Alexander. I'm going to give you one opportunity to cooperate fully with our investigation, or you're going to find yourself dealing with international espionage charges." The shock in Ricardo's voice was unmistakable. "Your Majesty, I didn't realize Isabella was speaking to you directly." "Now you do, and now you're going to answer our questions completely and honestly, or this conversation ends and you'll be dealing with Interpol instead of us." Ricardo was quiet for several moments before responding. "What do you want to know?" Director Collins took over the questioning. "I'm Director Collins of Valdorian Intelligence. We want a complete list of all properties you've purchased, all personnel involved in your operations, all equipment that's been installed, and all planned activities for the next 6 months." "I can't provide all of that information without consulting with my associates." "Then consult with them. We'll wait." Isabella listened as Ricardo put them on hold and began speaking rapidly in Astorian with several other voices. Even though she couldn't make out all the words, the tone of the conversation was clearly one of urgent crisis management. After nearly 10 minutes, Ricardo returned to the call. "I've been authorized to provide some information in exchange for guarantees about prosecution immunity." King Alexander and Director Collins exchanged glances before the king responded. "We can discuss immunity arrangements after we hear what you have to tell us." Ricardo took a deep breath before beginning what would be the most comprehensive revelation of foreign intelligence operations on Valdorian soil in decades. There are 12 properties total, all within 5 kilometers of the Valdorian border. Each has been equipped with electronic surveillance equipment capable of monitoring military communications, cell phone traffic, and internet data passing through regional networks. Director Collins was taking detailed notes as Ricardo continued. "The personnel involved include myself, 6 Astorian intelligence operatives, and approximately 20 local contractors who handle maintenance and technical operations. Most of the contractors don't know the true nature of what they're maintaining." "What about planned operations?" Director Collins asked. "There are 3 phases to the overall plan. Phase 1 was establishing the surveillance network, which is now complete. Phase 2 involves recruiting local assets within Valdorian government and military organizations. Phase 3? Ricardo paused, and Isabella could hear more urgent conversations in Astorian happening in the background. "Phase 3 involves what?" King Alexander pressed. "Economic disruption operations designed to create political instability. The goal is to weaken public confidence in the Valdorian government and create opportunities for increased Astorian influence in regional affairs." The implications of Ricardo's revelation were staggering. This wasn't just routine intelligence gathering or even simple espionage. It was a comprehensive operation designed to undermine Valdoria's sovereignty and independence. Director Collins looked at King Alexander and Prince Edward before asking the final critical question. "What is the timeline for Phase 2 and Phase 3 operations?" Phase 2 recruitment operations were supposed to begin next month. Phase 3 was planned for implementation over the following 12 months, depending on how successful the recruitment efforts were. King Alexander leaned back in his chair, processing the scope of what they had just learned. Isabella sat in stunned silence, finally understanding the full magnitude of what she had unknowingly helped to fund and establish. "Ricardo," the king said finally, "you have 1 hour to contact your associates and inform them that all operations are being shut down immediately. All equipment is to be removed from Valdorian soil, all personnel are to return to Astoria, and all planned activities are to be canceled permanently." "Your Majesty, I don't have the authority to make those decisions unilaterally." "Then you need to convince whoever does have that authority that the alternative is much worse for everyone involved." Director Collins added, "If we don't see immediate movement toward shutting down these operations, we'll be forced to involve international law enforcement and possibly NATO intelligence services." The mention of NATO seemed to have the desired effect. Ricardo's voice became more cooperative. "I'll make the calls immediately, but I need some kind of assurance that there won't be criminal prosecution if we comply fully." King Alexander looked at Director Collins, who nodded slightly. "If all operations cease within 72 hours, if all equipment and personnel are removed from Valdorian territory, and if you provide us with complete documentation of everything that was done, we'll consider this matter resolved without criminal charges." "And what about Isabella?" All eyes in the room turned to the Queen, who had been sitting quietly through most of the interrogation. King Alexander studied his wife's face before responding. "Isabella's situation will be handled separately." After ending the call with Ricardo, the room fell silent as everyone contemplated the implications of what they had just learned and the delicate international situation they now had to manage. Director Collins was the first to speak. "Your Majesty, We'll need to begin immediate surveillance of all 12 properties to verify that they're actually shutting down operations. We should also conduct a comprehensive security review to determine if there are other similar operations we haven't detected. Prince Edward, who had been largely silent during the interrogation, finally spoke up. What about the diplomatic implications? If word of this gets out, it could seriously damage relations between our kingdoms. King Alexander nodded thoughtfully. That's why we're going to handle this quietly. If Ricardo and his associates cooperate fully, there's no reason for this to become a public scandal that could harm both kingdoms. Isabella finally found her voice. Alexander, I want you to know that I will accept whatever consequences you think are appropriate for my actions. But I'm grateful that you're trying to resolve this in a way that doesn't create a diplomatic crisis. The king looked at his wife, and for the first time since the investigation began, Isabella could see some warmth returning to his eyes. Isabella, you made terrible choices, and you allowed yourself to be manipulated into funding operations against your adopted country. But I also believe that your confession today and your cooperation in stopping these operations show that your loyalty ultimately lies with Valdoria. What does that mean for our marriage? King Alexander was quiet for a long moment before answering. It means we have a lot of work to do to rebuild trust, but it also means that I believe our marriage is worth saving if you're willing to do that work. Isabella felt tears of relief beginning to form. I am, Alexander, more than anything. Director Collins cleared her throat diplomatically. Your Majesties, if I may suggest, we have a narrow window to manage this situation effectively. The next 72 hours will be critical. Over the following 3 days, Valdorian intelligence operatives monitored as Astorian personnel began dismantling surveillance equipment and evacuating the border properties. Ricardo provided detailed documentation of all operations, equipment, and personnel as promised. Most importantly, there were no leaks to media or other governments about the existence of the espionage network. On the 4th day, King Alexander called Isabella to his private study for a conversation that would determine the future of their relationship and her role as queen. The operation has been shut down completely, he began. Our intelligence services confirm that all surveillance equipment has been removed and all Astorian operatives have returned to their country. Isabella nodded, relief evident on her face. However, the king continued, there are still consequences that we need to address. The missing royal artifacts need to be recovered or replaced. The financial losses to the royal treasury need to be accounted for. And most importantly, we need to ensure that something like this never happens again. I understand, Isabella said. What do you need me to do? First, you'll be working with our financial investigators to recover as much of the stolen money as possible. Second, you'll be cooperating with efforts to retrieve the artifacts that were sold illegally. And third, you'll be accepting a significantly reduced role in official royal duties while we work to rebuild public and private trust. Isabella accepted each condition without argument. There's one more thing, King Alexander said, his voice becoming gentler. I want you to know that despite everything that's happened, I still love you. What you did was wrong, and it will take time for me to fully trust you again. But I believe in the possibility of redemption and forgiveness. Isabella crossed the room and took her husband's hands in hers. Alexander, I promise you that I will spend every day for the rest of my life proving that your faith in me is not misplaced. 6 months later, Queen Isabella had successfully helped recover nearly $40 million of the stolen funds and had managed to retrieve about half of the sold artifacts. Ricardo had relocated his business operations away from the border region and had severed all ties with Astorian intelligence services. The diplomatic relationship between Valdoria and Astoria remained stable, with both governments agreeing to pretend the entire incident had never occurred. Prince Edward, who had proven his readiness for future leadership through his handling of the crisis, was given expanded responsibilities in government affairs. The experience had strengthened his relationship with his father and had taught him valuable lessons about the complexities of royal duty. As for King Alexander and Queen Isabella, their marriage had survived its greatest test. Trust was being rebuilt slowly, day by day, through honesty, transparency, and a shared commitment to serving the kingdom of Valdoria with integrity. The hidden deal that had threatened to destroy everything they held dear had ultimately become the foundation for a stronger and more honest relationship. The royal artifacts that had been recovered were put on public display for the first time in decades, allowing the people of Valdoria to see and appreciate their cultural heritage. It was Isabella's idea, and it became her way of giving back to the kingdom she had unknowingly betrayed and ultimately chosen to protect.